Good afternoon. I'm Kathy Kinlaw, Associate Director at the Emory University Center for Ethics. On behalf of the Emory Center faculty, staff, and supporters who have made this possible, I welcome you to this important discussion with Dr. IBRAM Kendi. To start, I'm honored to introduce Emory University's 21st president, Dr. Greg Fenves, who joined us on August 1st. He has already made clear his commitment to social and racial equity, and we are delighted to have him welcome us today. President Fenves?
Well, thank you, Kathy. It's an honor to be joining you in this inaugural James W. Fowler event at the Center for Ethics here at Emory University. And on behalf of Emory University, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Kendi. This will be an important discussion that we'll have tonight, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But I also want to welcome one of our most renowned faculty members here at Emory, Dr. Carol Anderson, to help lead this conversation. So really appreciate Dr. Anderson and for all your efforts to bring tonight's dialogue to fruition. And tonight's event is one I've been looking for since the Center for Ethics announced it. The books by Dr. Kendi and Dr. Anderson should be required reading for every American today with this historic moment that we are going through. The summer, the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and here in Georgia, Rayshard Brooks and Ahmaud Arbery, and other African Americans have sparked a long needed renewal of a national awakening to anti-Black racism. At Emory, our community, and I want to especially recognize our students, have come together to raise their voices, to stand up against racism, to stand up against police violence, and to call for action. I met with many of the student leaders over the summer before I started as president in August to understand the history of the university, what had been done and what had not been done. And to establish a path forward. But it was based on listening to their stories of racism, of fear, of frustration, and yes, exhaustion among our very own students. And it was very, very moving. And I want to recognize those students along with our faculty and our staff who've bravely shared their experiences and have taken this historic moment and helped us turn it into a tide that it needs to be and a movement towards racial justice and equity. And not just nationwide, but here at Emory. And as president, I'm committed to this path. It is a path that we certainly need here at Emory. This summer has turned into the fall, and though the progress over the past has been too slow, we are starting to slowly make progress, but we need to work to make it quicker and to make it more impactful and to truly understand how racism permeates so many aspects of society and to seek to change that and for Emory to be a model, yes, of an anti-racist university. And so tonight we've come together. We want to thank Dr. Kendi for giving us this opportunity to come together, to listen to you, to what you have to say, what you've done, and to listen to how we make this dialogue and this historic moment a truly one that we'll remember. Because the dialogue doesn't end tonight. I look forward after tonight to continued discussions in the coming days and the months ahead as we prepare for our future, our anti-racist future, for Emory and the broader community here in Atlanta and beyond that we serve. These conversations will serve for more action and progress, and that's exactly what we need at this moment in time. So thank you, Dr. Kendi, for being here with us this evening, sharing your scholarship, your insights, and your needed call to action. So with that, Kathy, I'll turn the program back over to you.
Thanks very much. As Dr. Fenves indicated, our conversation today also marks the inaugural event honoring Dr. James W. Fowler, the first full-time director of our Emory University Center for Ethics. A man of deep vision, integrity, and moral courage, Jim Fowler would have been most grateful for this discussion. Thank you to the Fowler family and all whose support through the James Fowler Fund has made this event possible. During this conversation, if you have a question for Dr. Kendi, please submit using the Q&A, the question and answer link. Only our panelists will be able to see what you submit, and we certainly hope to include a number of your questions during the hour. Now it is my honor to introduce our discussants today. Dr. IBRAM Kendi is the director of the Boston University Center for Antiracist Research and the author of several pivotal books, including How to Be an Anti-Racist. Our moderator is Dr. Carol Anderson, the Charles Howard Candler Professor and Chair of African American Studies at Emory University. We are extremely fortunate to have both of these scholars and agents of change challenging us to take action today. Dr. Anderson, I turn the conversation over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you so much, President Finviz. And thank you so much, IBRAM. It's good seeing you again. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. My first question is, W.E.B. Du Bois, whom you cite a lot in the book. There's this, he's one of the most profound, pivotal scholars that we have. And his analysis has been just bedrock for understanding the conditions in America. And he believed that if he studied long enough, if he did the work to the utmost perfection, that he would get to the truth, and being able to tell that truth would be transformational in this society. And so there's this moment in 1899. So, as historians, we had to go back, right? So there's this moment in 1899 where we have just had a horrific lynching in Georgia. And he is ready to talk to the editor at the Atlanta newspaper. He's walking down the street on Mitchell Street, and there he sees a Black man's knuckles prominently displayed in the grocery store window. Sam Hose's knuckles. And he said it just knocked him, it pulled him off his feet, stopped him cold in his tracks. Because as he's on Mitchell Street thinking about this, he said, I knew that it wasn't simply telling people the truth. It was inducing them to act on the truth. So I ask you, how do we induce anti-racism action in the face of Sam Hose's knuckles, George Floyd's cries for his mother, Breonna Taylor's blood-soaked bed, and 7 bullets in Jacob Blake's back? What does anti-racist action look like in those conditions?
Wow. Well, first, let me just sort of thank the Center for Ethics and Emory for facilitating and organizing our conversation. I think it was mentioned, of course, that you are one of the more renowned scholars at Emory University. I would add one of the most renowned scholars in the country studying racism, and so I've learned so much from you and admire, of course, your work. And so, of course, I've just been waiting for this day for us to have a conversation. And to your point and to your question, I think that first and foremost, what I've been trying to sort of say to Americans is, what if we eliminated the term "not racist" from our vocabulary? Mm-hmm. And what if we realized that we're either being racist or anti-racist? What if we realized, after that horrific lynching of Sam Hose, or the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and Jacob Blake, that to do nothing was to be complicit? To do nothing was to allow for the persistence of that sort of form of racial terror, and that we must be actively a part of the struggle to ensure that the life of every single Black person, truly matters. What if it wasn't enough for us to just be aghast, as at the video? And what if we actually had to join an organization or fund an organization or provide our expertise to an organization that's challenging police violence, that's trying to reimagine public safety? And I think that that's really what it means to be anti-racist. I think it's no longer enough for us to, quote, be good people, whatever that means. It's no longer enough for even us to be aware of racism. We have to transform that awareness, as Du Bois did after that incident, into action.
Yes, absolutely. Because, one of the things he talked about was the need to have an organization that was fighting this racism, this anti-Blackness that was just destroying Black people.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you. So, we're just going to keep rolling.
Okay.
I loved how you focused this anti-racist work on policies, because of the power of policies, that it wasn't these kind of individual acts, it's the policies that have done the damage. And so I wanted to really engage for a minute on what dismantling policies that produce or sustain racial inequality look like in K through 12 education, in healthcare, in immigration policy.
Mm-hmm.
Because part of this is imagining what an anti-racist future looks like in order to know how to fight it, in order to know what our policies must be. So when we think about K through 12, what do you see as this anti-racism what an anti-racist K through 12 policy looks like?
So as you know, I'm in Boston right now, and there's a pretty sizable concentration of these boarding schools in the New England area where the super rich send their children to. Many middle-class white parents send their kids to these middle-class public high schools down the road, and are constantly thinking about, if we were to transform our educational system, that somehow it'll be more like that lesser resourced school down the road where Black and brown children are sort of going to school. But in fact, your sort of pretty good school would be more similar to the school that the super rich send their kids to around where I live, right? In which, your school would be overloaded with resources. And I think that, a different type of educational system, an anti-racist educational system, will not only provide first-class schools for every single child, no matter their race, no matter their class, but then we would also embrace the fact that we're a multicultural nation. And we would start to recognize that it's critically important to not just teach the culture and the history of white Americans and even people of European descent and teach European history, that it's just as critical to teach the history and culture of Native people, of African people, of Latinx people, people of Asian descent. And we would integrate that seamlessly into our curriculum, in which our children are not being raised to sort of standardize the cultures of people of European descent. We would also, instead of standardizing our tests, we would be standardizing our resources. And instead of sort of assessing instead of sort of assessing the nature of our teachers and students, we'd be assessing our policies consistently to ensure that they're creating equity, to ensure that we're providing a multicultural sort of education. And then we would probably be able to say that we have a meritorious educational system, and we would be able to stop And then people would no longer have to lie when they say that today.
And I think about, you know, one of the key issues in our way that schools are in fact funded that lead to these inequities deals with property taxes that are the overwhelming funding mechanism for K through 12.
So you're saying, Professor Anderson, that we have a system in which the people who have more resources at home are going to have more resources in their schools, or less resources at home are going to have less resources in their schools?
Sacre bleu. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And so what I want to kind of also understand is we also get into issues of healthcare, because, you know, you're laying out these massive disparities in terms of mortality rates, life expectancies, cancer rates, survival rates. All of this is that, what were the policies that have been sustained, and how have these policies been sustained over time that have created these kinds of embedded inequities in spite of, despite the movements that we have had, despite the kinds of scholarship, incredible scholarship that is out there about not only these inequities, but the consequences of these inequities.
Sure. So even if you take COVID-19 and how for the last 5 months we've known that Black people are dying at least 2 times the rate as white Americans, and many people initially believed it's because Black people were not taking the virus seriously, or Black people were not socially distancing, or Black people have more pre-existing conditions because Black people are lazy, they refuse to take care of their health, they're obese, and they're obese because they're so lazy. But what we know is actually what was even more predictive of Black people dying of COVID-19 than even pre-existing conditions has been air and water quality of the neighborhoods where Black people are forced to live in. And so now you're talking about redlining, you're talking about zoning laws, you're talking about Black people, not only the way in which the sort of political structure of a city sort of undergirds the sort of power of local Black residents, which don't give them the ability to fight when a waste transfer station wants to sort of set up a shop in their neighborhood, or in many cases, you know, through your work, particularly studying post-World War II, where many of these Black communities set up shop near industrial sites. And have stayed there, right? And have stayed there with the waste of those industrial sites. And so, or being forced to live near the bus terminal for the city, you know, as opposed to the wealthy white neighborhood, or as opposed to the terminal being outside, not close to anyone. And then also what's been more predictive, obviously, has been employment status, that Black people are less able to work from home. They're more likely to predominate in service-related industries, which then has to do with, you know, educational policies that we talked about earlier, which has to do with all sorts of employment discrimination from, you know, if you have a Black name, you're less likely to get an interview. If you're Black, you're most likely to be in a job, even a professional job, that's going to be downsized first. And so the irony, and I don't want to go on, but, you know, we are, you know, 160 or 70 years away from chattel slavery, but Black people are still working in predominantly the service industry. So we went literally from being enslaved to servants, and people are calling that progress. And then simultaneously saying that we're still there because of our own lack of hard work.
Right. You know, as you know, I'm intrigued by and work to dismantle those consistent narratives of Black pathology, as the kind of immediate go-to to explain why something didn't happen. Because, you know, Black folks just didn't show up. They didn't care about voting, so that's what happened in 2016. But missing the policy
Exactly.
that gutted the Voting Rights Act and the protections of that. So it's how do we begin to move through these policies in education, in housing, in employment? How does that work? I mean, the stories have just come out, Lord, about the forced sterilization. The policies that systematically deny humanity.
Yeah. And I'm sure, for those of us, of course, who know African American history, and we know Fannie Lou Hamer experienced a forced sterilization. We know that the eugenics movement, when Americans were outraged, rightfully so, about the ways in which Jewish people were being sort of slaughtered in Nazi Germany, in the United States during those same decades, Southern Black women in particular were being systematically sterilized up until the 1970s. And as we see, it's even still happening, with women in immigration centers. And this is eugenics. And, Americans commonly think that eugenics is a form of racism and that it's horrible and it's genocidal, but we have and still have eugenics operating, within our systems today.
And I'm intrigued, not intrigued, somewhere between infuriated and working to think through what that anti-racist policy looks like in all of these spheres, given how interconnected these are. So as we talked about education, then we're talking about property, and we're also talking about environmental concerns where, like Cancer Alley in Louisiana, that where all of the petrochemical plants are, and they're near poor Black neighborhoods, and the cancer rates along Cancer Alley are astronomical and disproportionate. So how all of these things are tied together becomes, I believe, one of the things that makes it so almost daunting as we're looking at this Leviathan. But also, to me, it also means that there are ways that we can get at it. Yeah. And so I wanted to ask you, what do you see the role of colleges and universities in creating and sustaining a society of anti-racism?
Well, I think if we could, as researchers, and when I say researchers, I'm even including students, if we could, as researchers, have the capacity to track, well, first collect and identify racial disparity data, and then we as researchers can then simultaneously track the actual racist policies that are leading to those disparities. And then we as researchers could actually, based on that research, propose anti-racist policy correctives. Those are all of which things, that researchers can do and have done. I mean, your book, One Person, No Vote, was clinical, in that respect, and really is a model for even what an individual scholar can do, in terms of studying the long swath of racist policies and their continuous sort of impact in disenfranchising people, and then the ways in which they're constantly sort of being rejuvenated and progressing and changing and becoming more sophisticated, and then there's movements against them, and even those movements against them, like the movement you documented in Alabama, is also something that's critical for people to see, to even be inspired by. But I think that's what we can do, and that's one of the reasons why we decided to build a center for anti-racist research, because researchers, and thereby the university, is critical in identifying the problem and proposing, the solution. And even shifting thereby the narrative as to who is the problem, and or I should say, what is the problem, and what the solution could be. And you know, and at some point, you know, as you know, Du Bois said around that same time to Black folks, how does it feel to be a problem? And I think we can say to universities, you know, how does it feel to potentially be a solution?
How does it feel to, and do you think that part of this work, because what we also know is that, you know, it's like how Elizabeth Hinton documented in her incredible book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, that it was also the research done in these colleges and universities that helped perpetuate and sustain and validate racist policies that embedded the kinds of inequities. So how do we provide the kind of check within the system to ensure that the researchers are in fact having really good, sound models?
Yeah.
You know, one of the things that we've also seen, a recent paper just came out in one of the medical journals dealing with, yeah, you know I'm talking about Black folks and their proclivity because they're Black to this disease, and without really getting into the kinds of social inequities that have in fact created this kind of thing. So how do we in a university, college and university environment, and this isn't like trying to check folk, but it's trying to make sure that we have the kind of engagement that leads to strong, healthy, anti-racist policies instead of a continuation of the racist policy?
Well, I think we have to be willing to distinguish very openly between anti-racist research and racist research. They have a different set of basic assumptions. And so the basic assumption of an anti-racist researcher is that there's nothing inferior or wrong with any racial group of people, whether Black people, Native people, or any other group of people. And the basic assumption of a racist researcher is they don't know. There could be something wrong with Black people. So let me investigate what, you know, it could be that it's because Black folks have bigger noses and that's why they're more likely to get COVID-19. So let me test that. Let me figure that out. And so then they go down that rabbit hole of trying to figure out what is wrong with Black people that could be behind the racial disparity or injustice. And then all of that, you know, brain power, all of those resources, all of those students, all of those books, all of those pages are written based on an assumption that is racist and has consistently proven to be false. Versus anti-racist research, if you start with the basic assumption that the racial groups are equals, then, and there's an inequity, you're going to then use that same brain power, those same resources, those students, your colleagues, to figure out, okay, what could be the policies that are leading to this inequity? And then you'll identify those policies, and then you'll tag those policies as racist, and then you can be involved in proposing anti-racist policies that consistently can drive down the problem. And then what happens, let me just go back to racist research. So then, you know, you figure out that Black people are the problem, then you propose solutions to those problem people, and then your solutions don't work. And then you say, well, it's because those people are the problem. And so then you continuously propose new solutions to fix a people that are not broken. And then it becomes this never-ending cycle in which you're continuously figuring out new ways to say there's something wrong with Black people when you, and the way in which you were approaching the research was the problem all along.
Okay, we can just drop the mic and be done right now. Because the role of scientific racism, the role of scholars who have, you're right, where the initial assumption is Black pathology. And when that is the initial assumption, everything else goes haywire. And, you know, Naomi Murakawa really showed this in her work in terms of the criminal justice system and the rise of the carceral state, beginning with the assumption, the bedrock assumption in the 1940s that Blacks were inherently criminal. So when that was the bedrock assumption, then the policies that emerged from that assumption all had this, they led us to where we are now, because the assumption of Black pathology, Black criminality, guided the policies, whether they then emerged into a benevolent form, as you're laying out in the book, right? Or whether they led to a punitive form. Yeah.
And it's, what's striking is, I think the other side of this is, you know, we have been taught, and it's been taught to us, that scholars, that there's subjective and objective scholarship. And obviously those scholars who have that basic assumption of Black pathology are imagining that they're being objective. Just like the progenitors of those scientists, largely who came over after being trained in German universities in the 1880s and 1890s and really built the research university in the United States, were also teaching sort of American scholars about objectivity. But you know what they also brought over? Eugenics. And many of them were scientific racists. So the very people who popularized the idea of the objective scholar are the very people who now we identify as the progenitors of scientific racism within the research university. But we have been like, okay, you know what, that idea of scientific racism, that's bad, but I'm gonna hold on to this other idea, even though it came out of the same mind. And so I think for the scholar to realize that there are basic assumptions that underlie our research questions, that the research question is certainly, you know, is important, but how we ask questions are based in our philosophy, based in our perspectives. And for whatever reason, scholars don't want to admit that basic truth.
I was at a conference where one scholar stood up and he said, "I am in the whitest." It was Charles Mills who wrote the racial contract, and he says, "I'm in the whitest discipline," and he didn't mean the whitest in terms of demographics. He meant the whitest in terms of the kinds of assumptions about what was truth, what was beauty, what was. And so those assumptions were embedded in a philosophy of racial hierarchy that then made the rest of the work very difficult. Yeah. So another question. You know, a lot's been going on. I mean, President Finvez was talking about, you know, in the midst of this pandemic, we see the horrors of George Floyd, the horrors of Ahmaud Arbery, the horrors of Rayshard Brooks, the horrors of Breonna Taylor, the horrors. And in that, you started seeing this phenomenon. 50 states, people in 50 states demonstrating that something was fundamentally wrong about what was happening here in our overarching, our underlying philosophies about justice, about the rule of law, about equality, about equity. You saw NASCAR say, we're getting rid of the Confederate flag. You started seeing these Confederate statues coming down. You started seeing the WNBA's always been there. Yeah, yeah. But you started seeing this and this movement. Are we in the midst of a zeitgeist, in the midst of a time of change, where if we do the work, we can really see that anti-racist society?
I think so. But I think as you asked, if we do the work, and I would say the work should be questions like, we have, as you've documented, voter suppression. What policies can eliminate the ability to voter suppress, right? We have, pervasive police violence. What are the policies that can eliminate police violence? We have a, white median wealth in this country is last I checked, 10 times the median wealth of Black people. What is a policy that can eliminate the racial wealth gap? What are policies that can eliminate the racial health disparities? What are policies that can eliminate the massive K through 12 funding gap that we talked about earlier? And I say this because that's a different type of question than to say, well, what can reduce the number of people whose votes are being suppressed?
Mm-hmm.
That's a completely different type of question. And so if we just ask the first question, then all of this energy, all of this awareness, this hurricane, literally, because even a hurricane toppled, a Confederate monument, I think in Louisiana, then it will be all for naught. And so I think that's the type of questions we need to be asking. What can eliminate, and that's where I derive, inspiration from the abolitionist movement, because abolitionists were not seeking, they were fighting against those Americans who were calling for the gradual emancipation, including President Lincoln. Even weeks before he signed the Emancipation Proclamation, he was writing to Congress and writing to Confederacy, you know what, if you stop, I will give you 37 years to gradually reduce, and you'll just have to end slavery before January 1, 1900, and I'm going to compensate you, meaning I'm going to give you reparations. But no, abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and Mariah Stewart earlier and William Lloyd Garrison were like, no, immediate emancipation now. They were like, what? We want slavery to end now, not tomorrow, not 30 years from now. And we can be calling for the same thing. How do we eliminate mass incarceration? And I think that's how we allow this moment to become, a moment that our sort of children and grandchildren will be remembering us as the generation that finally made, at least were able to create an anti-racist nation.
And it's so much, it's so much like what we were talking about with colleges and universities. It's how you ask the question. How you ask that initial question has so much to do then with what the probable and possible solutions are, what the next steps are in that asking of the question. So when you frame the question in a certain way, well, how do we, you've already lost but when you're asking the question like, how do we ensure that all American citizens have their right to vote respected and enabled? Wow, that's a very different question.
It is. And, as you know, that's the type of question that some of the radical Republicans were asking, and that's why they were not happy with the 15th Amendment. And so they were asking different types of questions. Part of the issue, though, is when we settle for a policy that gradually sort of reduces inequity, and then we project this as this landmark sort of law or this landmark bill, what's going to happen is people are going to be like, we're done. And then what's going to happen? Because it did not eliminate inequity, the inequity is going to persist. And then it's going to lead to a new round of, well, it's persisting because of Black pathology.
And okay, so we're in a Roberta Flack moment right now. Killing me softly, right? And it's this kind of, it's like what I've said about like the civil rights movement, where the civil rights movement after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, this kind of sense of, we have ended racism in the United States and we have overcome. And so you get this shifting, this narrative language that then says the inequities we continue to see after the civil rights movement cannot be born of the policies that continue to be engaged in the United States.
Yeah.
The continued redlining, the continued discrimination in hiring, the continued blocking of access to quality schools. It has to be a culture of poverty.
Yeah.
And so that is I think is part of this ongoing discussion that we're having, is that it's and so I have described the civil rights movement as understanding it as a first down.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a touchdown. It's important because you got to have those first downs,
Exactly.
right? It is a first down for all the football fans out there. It's a first down. But when it is treated like you have just won the Super Bowl,
Mm-hmm.
then you also get the phenomenon not only of look, if something's gone wrong, it must be something wrong with Black people, the narrative of Black pathology. But you also get the narrative of, if what more do you want?
Yeah, and I think that's that narrative, as you documented, certainly reinforces or even creates white rage, because folks are like, what about me? Like, we have instituted all these policies that have created equality. Meanwhile, I'm struggling, but now you want to do more for these people who already are receiving all these handouts. How dare you? And you say you care about me. Well, what about my life? What about all lives? What about, and so then you have it creates this political vacuum for an elected official or politician to then say to those people, yes, they are discriminating against you. Yes, they are harassing and oppressing you. And I'm going to be your defender. I'm going to build walls. I'm going to protect you. I'm not going to let those anarchists overrun the suburbs. And you don't have to fear them because I'm going to be here now. If that other guy gets in, though, then and it creates this scenario.
We've got about 15 more minutes, but I'm loving this conversation. Thank you. What do you see as the relationship between anti-racism, justice, and equity?
I think to be anti-racist at the most basic level is to fight for equity and justice. That is the end goal. It should be the end goal of an anti-racist policy. It should be the end goal of an anti-racist institution. And it should be the sort of North Star of any person who's being anti-racist.
Yeah. It's like even imagining that world.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here? What do you see as the next steps in advancing anti-racism efforts?
I think that we should researchers should, we should have an understanding of every single policy that is leading to every single inequity across the nation as well as in every community. We should be working to identify those policies. We should be working to develop corrective policies. And then we as a community of people should be working to get in positions of power that we can drive in those policies, or you know, supporting organizations that are pushing for those policies. We just need policy change, and we need to be focused on changing power and policy. You know, and we cannot get distracted by racist ideas, and we cannot get distracted by thoughts that no, the problem is people, or that it's impossible to transform this country. Indeed, this country, as I write about, has metastatic racism. It's spread to every part of the body politic. But that doesn't mean we can't fight to heal this country against all odds.
So what should our students be doing now?
I think our students should be involved in that research, in that learning, in that self-education, should be thinking very deeply about, as they think about their own personal sort of life goals or even career paths, how they're going to institute, you know, anti-racism within sort of their own path. You know, this, as we know, I mean, race and racism really touches every area of, you know, of human and American life. And so no matter what you're interested in going in, whether it's sort of law, social work, or journalism, you know, or philosophy, you name it, there's an anti-racist perspective in doing that type of work. And so are you sort of thinking about that, or are you consuming wholesale these racist ideas and notions of Black pathology that in many cases were foundational to these disciplines? Or are you thinking of ways to reject that and really thereby being part of the solution?
And how do you see this work with our students, with our researchers in our colleges and universities, with our broader communities? How do you see that kind of interaction, that kind of anti-racism work as we're working with policymakers, as we're working with grassroots mobile activists? How do you see that working in that kind of sphere?
Well, I mean, as you know, one of the beauties of African American studies, you know, as a discipline, particularly when it was originated by students, is they viewed their courses, they viewed their learning as seeking to really be able to impact the larger community, and whether that's through them using their learning to go and join community organizations, or whether that was them assisting community through service learning courses, as we now call them. You know, I think that we need to create, as professors and even as staff and administrators, those avenues for students to be involved in the type of work that they're learning about in the classroom. But at the same time, we have to provide support for faculty to do that, because it's already hard enough to do your own research, to teach courses, to do service work. And so we can't then say, okay, you know, well, let's put this whole other thing on your plate without providing sort of resources. And I say that because so many faculty, particularly faculty of color, do this on their own, and then they don't receive credit for it when they go up for promotion and tenure. They don't receive credit for it in their salary. And so in a way, they're doing unpaid labor. And I don't think anybody in any organization, I think the things that people are doing for the betterment of the student and community and university should be accounted for, because it's crucial, essential work.
I mean, this is, when you think about the work to me of a college and of a university, it is about creating the kind of knowledge base, but also the kind of civic engagement that strengthens a democracy, that strengthens and empowers all of those who live in that community, who live in that society. And so to think through how we do that and what we know, I mean, it's you beautifully documented, what we know is that when we have these policies that systematically begin with a sense of racial hierarchy, a sense with racial pathology, that what happens is that gets replicated then, and it does damage in that society. And so you find communities working through ways to protect themselves. And and it's one of the things when you're using your energy and your strength as a means of protection. It's almost, it's instead of being able to move forward because you're just trying to hold on. This is the power, the energy, and the resources that get wasted.
Yeah. And the other aspect of this, to me, it is even in the self-interest of the university to do this. I mean, whether it allows the university to have a better relationship with the community that it lives in the greater community. It allows the university to expose itself and its work to those potential students. Almost every major donor is asking a university, okay, what's going to be the impact, of this research, of this program, and then simultaneously we have a larger populace that has long been asking, okay, how is this relevant? How is what's happening on that campus relevant? And how is it impacting my life? And I think for the university to be engaged in the type of research that is leading to policies and policy change allows just regular people to see how it's relevant. And I will say that if there is a good thing that came out of COVID and this pandemic is regular folks have realized how critical data and research is to their own lives, right? And so I think we need to, as universities and as researchers, to step into that sort of moment and continue to show people how important research can be to transforming and bettering or allowing them to protect themselves as it has, against a global pandemic.
Okay. And thank you. And I've got one of the other questions I wanted to know was, and I guess I should have asked this first. When you began to conceptualize this book, what was the catalyst? I know you'd worked on STAMP from the beginning. What was the thing that you just said? And now you know how we always have our plan on what we're going to write.
And it never works out that way, right?
It never works out that way. What led you to really conceptualize anti-racism?
I think for me, it was that throughout the history of particularly those who were producing and mass circulating racist ideas, they were consistently self-identifying their own ideas in today's terms as not racist. And so for me, I knew I couldn't use that term. I also looked out and saw people consistently engaging in racism and simultaneously self-identifying as not racist. And I also saw that people imagining that to do nothing or to be passive was to be distinct from those who were being racist. And so I think all of that, I think, caused me to realize that I wanted to sort of elevate, a term that fundamentally spoke about racism as being normal. So that's why you had to be anti-racist. You had to be anti that normality, but also was fundamentally active, right? And so that's why, even for STAMP from the beginning, and of course developed it through How to Be an Anti-Racist, I thought the term anti-racist would fly. And I also, as I documented in STAMP from the beginning, that one of the sort of one of the people who really has modeled being anti-racist for more than 50 years was of course Angela Davis, who in the late 1970s, said at a speech in the Bay Area that it's not enough to be not racist, we must be anti-racist.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been just wonderful, wonderful. Now we've got some questions from our audience. You want to get some water?
Oh, I'm good.
Okay.
Yes.
But first, I'm going to start with some of the questions we've received from our students.
Okay.
So from an Emory student, has a two-parter. First, what are the 3 most important policies, in your opinion, to support being an effective long-term anti-racist?
So I would say reparations, Medicare for all, and I would also say a combination of automatic registration that can never be taken away, combined with all voting always being done on holidays where everyone is reimbursed by the government for their wages so that they don't have to work, combined with people being able to vote in every way they're able to bank.
So healthcare, democracy. Yeah. Second part of our students' question. I read that you appreciate when you receive critique that you've oversimplified racist or anti-racist, no neutral stance. Can you talk about those critiques? And how did those critiques challenge or reinforce your research?
Yeah, and so what's fascinating is you've had people who've said that, oh, I'm just oversimplifying racism, or I'm oversimplifying this sort of divide between racist and anti-racist. And I see that as a compliment, because to me, as you know, one of the beauties about those of us who've studied racism, and really the field for the last 40 years, is that, we have been able to really sort of grow and understand the way racism is operating in many different manifestations, and we've really been able to complicate it. But what we haven't been able to do, and you've been able to do this, and other scholars have been able to do this, is then clarify those complexities, to hold the complexity, but clarify it in a way that everyday people can understand, in which it sounds simple, even though it's not really simple. Just like, some LeBron James getting up there and doing a windmill dunk, it looks so easy. It's actually extremely complex and hard, right? But for the person, it's like, oh, that's easy. And actually, why can't people understand racism? Why is that actually a bad thing for us to be able to understand one of the greatest ills of our time?
And I think we've got time for one more question.
Okay.
Because, and this is from a student from Morehouse.
Okay.
Say we get to an anti-racist nation.
Mhm.
What do you think will be the next thing that's going to take racism's place to destabilize all of the work of anti-racism?
Well, I mean, I think that if we truly get to an anti-racist place in space, we would then have had to confront every other form of bigotry.
Mm-hmm.
Because, for instance, when you think about the sort of what Black women are facing, they're not just facing racism, they're also facing sexism, but even more importantly, they're facing their intersection, right? So in order to really, fight that form of racism, you have to fight that form of sexism, right? And I'm saying that all to say, but then if we get to a place in which we have been able to drive out all of these forms of bigotry that are overlapping and intersecting with racism, then we cannot rest up. It's equivalent. That's why I use the analogy of cancer, because if you've experienced metastatic cancer or even non-metastatic cancer, and you get to a point in which doctors can no longer see any cancer cells, they don't say, okay, go home, I don't never have to see you again. No, they actually scan your body continuously, very closely, to make sure that there's no reoccurrence of racial inequity anywhere. And if there is, they quickly respond, right? And I think that's how we would have to be if we were able to ever sort of heal this American body of inequities and injustices. That would only be the beginning. Just like you have cancer people today who are still concerned about whether the cancer is going to return, we would still need to be concerned as an American people as to whether this cancer of racism is going to return.
IBRAM, thank you, thank you, thank you. I am now going to turn it back over to my colleague, Kathy Kinlaw.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson.
Well, let me just say, Dr. Kendi and Dr. Anderson, thank you for this extraordinary discussion and the challenge that I think you've given all of us in the university and college settings, and of course beyond to our individual decisions and our individual actions. We will look forward to continuing this discussion with you, folks at Emory, with other collaborating colleges and universities, and with the Atlanta community at large. And hopefully there'll be one day we actually are able to bring you to campus, Dr. Kendi. For those attending, a link to a recording of this event will be sent to all registrants, and it will include information about some important following events to today. I hope that you can continue to join us in this critical conversation. And our appreciation once again to the James Fowler Fund and to each of you for joining us. Thanks so very much.